Somewhere between today and Star Trek's 60th birthday, something happened that hasn't happened in almost a decade. Every Star Trek show that was airing has wrapped. Every Star Trek show that was filming has finished. And right now, for the first time in roughly 10 years, there is no live-action Star Trek production of any kind anywhere on Earth. No cameras rolling, no sets standing, nothing. Paramount's answer to that gap is a single movie. It doesn't have a title yet. It doesn't have a cast yet. It doesn't even have a confirmed link to Kirk, Picard, or the Enterprise. What it does have is two directors best known for turning one of the most notoriously difficult fandoms in gaming into a genuinely beloved studio comedy. Now, those same two guys have been handed 60 years of Star Trek history and told, more or less, to start fresh. Let's talk about how we got here, what's actually confirmed, and why the last time Paramount tried this exact experiment, it went about as badly as it possibly could have. In April of 2026, Paramount Skydance stood on stage at CinemaCon, the biggest gathering of theater owners and studio executives in the industry, and confirmed that a new Star Trek movie is officially in development. That sentence alone is bigger than it sounds, because the last Star Trek film to actually play in a movie theater was Star Trek Beyond, all the way back in 2016. A full decade with no Star Trek on the big screen. Here's what we actually know. This is not Star Trek 4. It is not a continuation of Chris Pine's Kirk or Zachary Quinto's Spock or anyone from the 2009 reboot trilogy. It is described as a wholly original film, disconnected from any previous movie, any previous show, and any previous attempt at a script. The writing and directing duo attached is Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daly, the team behind Dungeons & Dragons, Honor Among Thieves, and before that, the screenplay for Spider-Man: Homecoming. They'll write, direct, and produce through their own banner, and by every account, they're starting with a blank page. No legacy characters required, no decades of continuity to honor, just the name Star Trek and whatever they choose to do with it. To understand why Paramount is doing this, you have to understand what they're walking away from. Back in 2009, J.J. Abrams rebooted Star Trek with a new cast playing younger versions of Kirk, Spock, and the rest of the crew, set in a splintered alternate reality fans nicknamed the Kelvin timeline. That film is, by the numbers, one of the best reviewed entries the franchise has ever produced, and its sequel did well too. Then came Beyond in 2016, which underperformed at the box office, and the wheels quietly came off. The cast got older, busier, and considerably more expensive to reassemble, and contract negotiations with a couple of key actors broke down entirely. Skydance's own leadership has since said plainly, on an earnings call with investors, that whatever comes next will not be set in that timeline. Chris Pine, for his part, was asked earlier this year if he had any advice for the new studio bosses about the franchise. His response was short and about as gracious as it gets under the circumstances. Rather than a dramatic cancellation, the Kelvin era simply ran out of momentum, and Paramount let it go. Now here's where it gets genuinely wild, because before Goldstein and Daly ever entered the picture, Paramount spent close to 8 years failing to make a follow-up movie at all. It's worth walking through this, because it explains a lot about why fans have learned not to get excited until cameras are actually rolling. Round 1. Quentin Tarantino pitched his own R-rated Star Trek concept back in 2017. A script got written. Then in early 2020, Tarantino decided he didn't want to direct it himself, and the project quietly died. Round 2, running in parallel. A director named S.J. Clarkson was hired to make a direct sequel to Beyond, built around Kirk reuniting with his time-displaced father. That fell apart in 2019 when contract talks with two of the lead actors collapsed. Round 3. Noah Hawley, the mind behind Fargo and Legion, was brought on to write and direct a completely different, unconnected Star Trek story involving a virus wiping out much of known space. Paramount put that on ice not long after, in part because a pandemic-themed blockbuster suddenly felt like bad timing for reasons everyone can probably guess. Round 4. Matt Shakman signed on in 2021. This version actually got close. Stages were built. Crew was hired. Shakman himself has since said they were genuinely moving toward a start date. Then WandaVision blew up his career, Marvel came calling with Fantastic Four, and by the summer of 2022, the production had lost its stages and its crew right out from under it. Paramount formally shelved the whole thing in November of 2024. 4 directors, 3 unrelated storylines, 0 frames of footage. That is the actual official history of the movie Goldstein and Daly are now replacing. Here's the uncomfortable part. Paramount has already run a version of this exact experiment once, quietly, and it did not go well. In January of 2025, Paramount Plus released Star Trek Section 31, a streaming-only film built around Michelle Yeoh's character from Discovery, with a brand new crew and no ties to Kirk or Picard at all. Depending on which day you checked Rotten Tomatoes in the weeks after release, the score sat somewhere in the high teens to low 20s, which made it, by a wide margin, the worst reviewed project in the franchise's entire history, film or television. For context, that's worse than Star Trek V, the one where the crew finds a guy who claims to be God living at the center of the galaxy. What's interesting is why it failed. Critics weren't bothered that the characters were unfamiliar. They were bothered that the movie didn't feel like Star Trek at all, that it played like a generic heist thriller wearing a Starfleet costume, with none of the ideas, ethics, or curiosity that have kept this franchise alive for 6 decades. It's also worth noting the first Star Trek film ever made without the Enterprise appearing on screen in any form. That distinction matters enormously for what comes next. It suggests the real risk was never new faces. Audiences already proved they'll accept a total recast back in 2009. The actual risk is making a Star Trek story that forgets to be about anything. While all of this was happening on the movie side, the television side of Star Trek quietly fell apart as well. Starfleet Academy premiered on Paramount Plus in January of 2026 and split the fandom right down the middle. It scored well with critics, but the audience response was rocky, and it never cracked the streaming platform's own weekly top 10. A second season had already been filmed before the first one even finished airing, but weeks after the season 1 finale, Paramount canceled the show outright. A fan petition asking the studio to reverse course crossed 40,000 signatures within days. It didn't work. By April, the physical sets were already being torn down, with pieces reportedly headed to auction. Strange New Worlds, one of the more warmly received modern Trek shows, is set to end after its 5th season, which is already wrapped filming. A pitch for a follow-up series bridging that show into the original 1960s timeline has been floated but never officially greenlit. Add it all up, and for the first time in almost a decade, there is no Star Trek television or film production actively happening anywhere. The executive who has steered the franchise's streaming era since 2018 is also reportedly up for a contract renewal this year, with no confirmation yet on whether he's staying. This new, unnamed movie isn't just a creative swing anymore. It's currently the only thing keeping the lights on. This is where the story gets genuinely confusing, and most coverage glosses right over it. Back in August of 2025, right after the Paramount Skydance merger officially closed, reporting surfaced describing 2 separate Star Trek movies already quietly in motion. One was described as featuring an entirely new cast, with Andor's Toby Haynes attached to direct and Seth Grahame-Smith writing the script. The other was described as bringing back Kirk, Spock, and the rest of the original crew in some form, with a different writer and the same producer overseeing both. Then, in November of 2025, it was reported that Goldstein and Daly had been brought on for yet another Star Trek project, described separately from those 2 earlier tracks. Only their movie has received a clear, on-the-record confirmation from the studio. What happened to the other 2? Nobody outside a handful of Paramount offices seems to know for certain. They may have been folded into this one project. They may have been quietly shelved. They may still be sitting in development with no updates, simply because there's nothing to announce yet. Right now, the honest answer is that we don't actually know how many Star Trek movies are coming, or whether any of them will end up connected to each other at all. So, the real question: can Goldstein and Daly deliver something worth the risk Paramount is taking? Their track record gives some reason for cautious optimism. Both Dungeons & Dragons, Honor Among Thieves, and their earlier screenplay for Spider-Man, Homecoming sit comfortably above 90% with critics, which is a rare thing for studio genre films built around expensive, fan-scrutinized properties. What made Honor Among Thieves work wasn't just the jokes. It was that the characters had real stakes and real relationships underneath the comedy, even while the film itself underperformed at the box office, likely more due to release timing than quality. They're also not strictly a comedy duo. Their next release is Mayday, a grounded Cold War thriller starring Ryan Reynolds, due out later this year, which suggests they're capable of handling tension and stakes without leaning entirely on jokes. None of that guarantees anything, but it does mean Paramount picked two of the more critically reliable writer-directors working in blockbuster comedy right now, and handed them a franchise that has, historically, survived by being curious rather than loud. Before anyone gets too excited, it's worth pointing out what CinemaCon actually is. It's not a fan convention. It's a trade show for theater owners and investors. And Skydance's CEO was there largely to reassure exhibitors and shareholders about the studio's direction, particularly given the enormous debt load tied up in its ongoing bid to acquire Warner Brothers. Confirming a Star Trek movie was one small part of a much bigger pitch about theatrical releases in general, alongside other franchise names on the same slate. It's also worth sitting with the fact that this same period of news included the quiet final burial of the previous Star Trek movie attempt after 8 years of false starts, and the cancellation of the studio's most recent Star Trek television series. So while the announcement is genuinely good news for a franchise that badly needed some, it may be less Star Trek is thriving, and more, this is currently the only news Star Trek has. There's a small irony sitting underneath all of this. Star Trek turns 60 this year, and the anniversary gift so far is not a movie in theaters. It's uncertainty. Longtime fans will appreciate one more detail buried in the timing. The number 47 has been a running-in joke throughout Star Trek since the Next Generation era, showing up in scripts as a kind of franchise signature. And this would have been the 47th year since the very first Star Trek movie hit theaters back in 1979. That symmetry came and went without a release to match it. If you're wondering when we'll actually learn more, there are a handful of events later this year where Paramount could reasonably drop additional details. San Diego Comic-Con in July, Star Trek Day in September, New York Comic-Con in October, and CCXP in Brazil come December. Realistically, even with a confirmed announcement today, a film like this is probably still a year or two away from an actual release date. Here's the actual question worth sitting with, and it isn't whether this movie will be good. It's whether Star Trek can prove it's a universe built on ideas big enough to survive without its two most famous captains standing at the front of it. Gene Roddenberry built this thing around curiosity, optimism, and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about who we are as a species. Kirk and Picard were vehicles for that vision, not the vision itself. Section 31 forgot that, and it currently sits at the bottom of the franchise's own scoreboard because of it. The 2009 reboot remembered it, and it's still considered one of the best reviewed entries the series has ever produced. Goldstein and Daly now have to decide which of those two outcomes they're building toward, with no cast, no title, and not much room for a third failed attempt. I'd genuinely like to know what you think belongs in this new corner of the Star Trek universe, and whether you think a story like this can actually work without the Enterprise anywhere in the frame. Drop that in the comments. Until next time, live long and keep an eye on the stars.